Hello, so this is your presentation on the evolution of social work theory. So we're going right back in time today. So just to be clear, the context presented here is very much focused on the Western world, and this is because this has been the contextual basis of the development of social work theory. So that's why we're focusing on Western world. So if we're thinking about a very brief historical backdrop, and I'm no historian, we're going to start by thinking and flagging really that if we're looking at early modern Europe, so the sort of 15th century onwards, we were looking at a period whereby there was widespread colonisation. So this really led to the exploitation of people and resources, which brought immense wealth to Europe. We also had the Protestant Reformation in the sort of 16th century. So this was a period where there was a fragmentation of religious thought and conflict at the time. So quite significant movements within early modern Europe. We also had a little bit later, so after the sort of 1800s, we had the Industrial Revolution. So we had the Industrial Revolution, which was a period of capital accumulation within Western Europe and rapid urbanisation. So people were moving from rural communities to cities to work in factories at that time. We also had this political reform in some areas of Europe where societies were moving away from this kind of absolutist rule to more parliamentary regimes. There was also a decline in the emphasis on religious worldviews, so this phenomenon of secularization was happening as well. Okay, so we're now going to move on to look at the intellectual and philosophical development, and we're going way back now and starting with the scientific revolution, the 16th and 17th century. So if we think about the backdrop of massive wealth accumulation, religious conflict, the scientific revolution was a time where there were new and challenging ideas about how the universe worked. So Newton's laws of the universe, simple principles of maths, these new methods and evidence to make conclusions was starting to be found within this scientific revolution. And then we moved into a period of the Enlightenment, and this is the 17th to 18th century. And so within the Enlightenment is this idea that actually knowledge is not something that you just have, it's not innate, and that knowledge is derived from experience. And the role of empirical evidence is seen as integral in forming ideas. The idea of individualism, so the intrinsic worth of individuals, the idea that everybody owns their own body and can acquire property through labour, this idea of individualism was significant within this period of enlightenment. And then once we moved from the 18th into the 19th century, we moved into modernity or modernism. So this is really reflective of modern society where the world is seen as being open to transformation by human intervention. So because of this growth in urbanisation, industrialisation, we had a range of complex institutions, political institutions, economic institutions, and that we were really living for the future as opposed to the past. So in this kind of modernist era, we were starting to use reasoning to look at a whole range of tricky questions, with the idea that science will move us forward in this kind of continuous improvement where we will master the problems that the world experiences. So this idea of modernism. And if we look at that kind of academic development, really this fits with this idea of modernism, where we had in the 1830s the development of social sciences as an academic discipline, which aimed to use scientific reasoning to solve the problems of society. So this idea that actually now that society has changed, has become modern, the breakdown of those small communities, we were starting to see a whole range of social problems in those urbanised areas, and social sciences grew out of this desire to use those ideas about scientific reasoning to solve some of those problems. And then a little bit later, in the 1880s, we saw disciplines in psychology and sociology and economics emerging alongside the birth of the modern state. For example, sociology arose in response to those social problems that I've just mentioned. Now, once we got into the late 1950s, so bringing this much more into this more modern era, I guess, we had the idea of postmodernism. And postmodernism was a rejection of modernism, a scepticism towards some of the grand narratives of modernism. Opposing the idea of certainty and stability of meaning, this sort of emphasis that actually there are many realities and that actually we can look for relative truths of each person, but we won't find a grand narrative that explains all of the problems, all of the ills of modern society. And actually postmodernism assumes that social problems stem from social structures and cultural assumptions more than from individual problems. So actually key to postmodernist ideas is that actually ideology is the principal obstacle to human liberation. So quite a fundamental shift for those people who come from a more of a postmodernist perspective. And critical theory was really fundamental to postmodernist ideas. Okay, so if we think about what that context means in terms of social work, we can see that it led to some tension within the profession. And social work is a profession that sort of takes from a whole range of academic disciplines. Two of the key disciplines that have influenced social work are sociology and psychology. And if we think about the basis of those two disciplines, they are really quite different in their focus. So sociology is very much focused on social and political reform. So I guess, comes very much from a sort of postmodern perspective in terms of intellectual thought. And then you have that kind of discipline of psychology which draws more on modernist ideas and is focused very much on changing the individual, so locates problems within the individual, as opposed to sociology locating problems within the social and political domain. So there's that kind of tension really that's existed within social work. And some of these tensions have been going back some considerable time. So it links with this idea of there being two types of social work that drives for clarity and certainty, where it's appealing to have the rigour of scientific thought and analysis, evidence-based practice, practice very much lends itself to that end, that social work should be rational. We should be able to prove what we do is effective. And then on the other end is this idea that actually people and relationships are far too complex than this would suggest, and that actually it's being in the relationship that gives insight into what's going on. So this idea that actually, ideas, these are relative truths of each person and not a grand narrative or truth about people as a whole or society as a whole. And even if we go way back to kind of Porter Lee in 1929, identified that temperamentally social workers tend to be inclined towards one of these ends of a continuum, I guess. The first is about pursuing the causes of people's difficulties, which is seen as being more radical social work, as opposed to carrying out functions, a more conservative leaning, whereby we are carrying out functions of the state. And these are some of the tensions and some of the debates that have been going on, through all times in relation to social work and continue to go on to the present day. So this idea of, is social work an art or is it a science? These are really debates that are still had within social work. Okay, so if we're thinking about theory that has informed our intervention with the people that we engage with in social work, we would see that within the 1940s and 50s, social work was dominated by psychological and psychoanalytic theory. So, for example, Freud. And also Carl Rogers' person-centred counselling from the 1940s as well. So there was very much a focus on quite long-term therapeutic relationships within social work back in the 1940s and 50s, this kind of casework relationship. And then this became quite heavily criticised for, not being very good value for money, keeping people within that relationship, helping relationship for long periods of time without any notable evidence base for the effectiveness. That this was widely criticised, and so in the 1960s we saw this move towards what's termed as more problem-focused approaches. So these approaches, notably task-centred practice and crisis intervention, were coincided with sort of liberal market economics, valuing and rewarding individuals who set about their life with a positive outlook, short-term work focused on personal responsibility. And in the late 1960s, we saw ideas from other disciplines like science, physics, biology, starting to influence social work, as well as family therapy. So family therapy had a big influence on social work in the late 60s and early 70s, and developed what we know now as systems theory. And then if we move on to the 1970s, we saw a growth of psychological approaches focused under like behavioural therapy and cognitive therapy, culminating in cognitive behavioural therapies. So these very much focused on individual mental states and behaviour, and focused on developing a strong evidence base for effectiveness. So these became incredibly popular throughout the 1970s. As we moved in the 1980s, we saw there was a lot of writing and thought about moving away from these deficit-based approaches into more strengths-based and solution-focused approaches. So these really gathered momentum and gather momentum to this day. And then as we move into the 2000s, we saw writers begin to talk about that the relationship had been lost from social work, that the importance and the centrality of the relationship had been lost. So we started to see writers writing about relationship-based practice. And drawing on ideas from a whole range of other theoretical positions like psychoanalysis, humanism, and systems. So we see quite a lot about relationship-based practice since the 2000s to the present day. So these are some of the key theories that inform intervention within social work that we will be learning much more about as we go through the module. So I look forward to exploring those with you.